It was early August of the year 2025, and the morning sky shimmered with a gentle pink hue that foretold another sweltering day. High in the rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a faint breeze rustled the tall pines, carrying with it the crisp scent of sap and moist earth. The forest floor lay covered in a thick blanket of pine needles, which crunched softly underfoot. A hush enveloped the woods, broken only by the occasional call of a crow or the distant murmur of a nearby stream. Into this stillness stepped Jonah Renshaw, a 30-something adventurer with a somewhat lopsided sense of humor and a sturdy pair of hiking boots he had proudly purchased at a camping outlet sale. Jonah had decided to spend a few days trekking through the wilderness, partly to photograph rare birds for his modest nature blog, but mostly to find a sense of inner peace he felt he had lost somewhere between deadlines and daily errands back home. Clad in well-worn cargo pants and a faded green jacket, he carried his backpack filled with essentials, plus a few not-so-essentials like a small plush keychain in the shape of a moose, which he claimed was his lucky charm. Jonah always had a knack for blundering into odd situations. He was the sort of person whose best-laid plans often veered into comedic territory. Yet, despite an occasional tendency to bumble, he possessed a kind heart and a fierce protective streak for any creature in need. He had volunteered at shelters, rescued stray dogs from busy intersections, and once even sat in a rowboat for 3 hours to untangle a duck from fishing line. So, perhaps it was inevitable that he would eventually cross paths with an animal in peril in one of the most remote regions he had ever traveled. That morning, Jonah set out around 6 o'clock, the forest still draped in the silver glow of dawn. The temperature hovered around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to keep his jacket zipped for a while longer. He followed a narrow trail that wound between moss-laden rocks and fallen logs, stepping carefully over roots that curled like sleeping snakes. With every breath he took, the air seemed to offer a gentle reminder of nature's grandeur. The tang of cedar, the dampness of fertile soil, the whisper of breeze through needles overhead. He was humming a tune, some old pop song from the 90s he could barely recall the words to, when he heard the strangest sound. At first, it was so faint he thought it might be the wind whining through the branches. But then a short, high-pitched yowl echoed, sending a small thrill through his spine. It was definitely not the wind. Jonah paused, heart pounding a bit faster than before. He was used to the calls of birds or the rustle of squirrels, but this was different, an eerie, piercing cry of distress. Curiosity got the best of him. He left the narrow main trail and pushed through a cluster of young pines. Pine boughs brushed against his jacket, releasing a resinous aroma that clung to his nostrils. A moment later, he slipped on a patch of damp needles and nearly fell face-first into the undergrowth. Chuckling to himself, he muttered, "So much for sneaking around gracefully," then continued on, letting his ears guide him. The yowl came again, soft yet urgent. Jonah quickened his pace, carefully maneuvering over protruding roots and around large ferns. For a fleeting moment, he imagined it might be a small wildcat, maybe a bobcat or a lynx, but the cry was too delicate. Perhaps it was a domestic cat, lost or abandoned. The thought made his stomach twist with concern. After another minute of weaving through bushes, he entered a small clearing lit by shafts of early sunlight. In the center of that clearing, crouched on top of a fallen log, was a small cat, its fur a mottled blend of brown and black stripes, and its bright green eyes wide with alarm. A length of twisted rope was wrapped around its hind leg, effectively binding it to the log. The cat's paw was bleeding slightly, and it was growling in short, pitiful spurts, as though half terrified and half exhausted from the ordeal. Jonah's heart froze. The sight of that tiny, helpless creature triggered both sorrow and determination within him. He set his backpack down slowly, raising his hands as if approaching a frightened child. "Easy now, friend," he said, voice gentle but trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." The cat flattened its ears, and a low hiss escaped its throat. Jonah swallowed hard, realizing that fear might push the cat to scratch or bite. He searched his backpack for something he could use as a makeshift bandage. He finally pulled out an old bandana that smelled vaguely of bug spray and peanut butter, his typical lunch of choice on the trail. With cautious steps, Jonah drew closer. He noticed the rope seemed strangely deliberate, like something a person might have placed. It was thick, coarse, possibly part of a snare. A sense of dread crept over him. Was someone trapping animals out here? But who would snare a little cat? Jonah felt anger mixed with his concern. The forest was supposed to be a place of freedom, not cruelty. As he crouched down, Jonah's mind whirled with questions. Is this cat a runaway from a campsite? Did someone intentionally leave it here? Is there a poacher or trapper lurking nearby? He forced himself to focus on the immediate task, freeing the cat. Carefully, he reached out. The cat let out another hiss, its eyes glimmering with panic. Jonah spoke softly, weaving a gentle stream of reassurances. It's okay, buddy. I know it hurts, but I'm here to help. The cat seemed to calm for a brief moment, as if understanding that Jonah's intentions were good. With trembling hands, Jonah tugged at the rope. It was knotted too tightly to slip off easily, so he pulled a small folding knife from his pocket. If this cat decides to bite, so be it. He slid the blade under the rope, moving with deliberate slowness. One sharp cut, and the rope fell away, freeing the cat's leg. The cat jerked back in surprise, stumbling slightly on the injured paw. Then, as if the shock of pain and terror had momentarily subsided, it tried to escape. It hopped off the log and almost collapsed on the ground, panting. Jonah quickly removed his jacket and placed it over the cat like a gentle shield, hoping to keep it still and warm. He could feel the cat's heart racing through the fabric. For a second, Jonah wondered if he was out of his depth. Yet something inside him roared that turning back was not an option. The cat needed help, and if Jonah left it, there was no telling what might happen. He ran his fingers across the cat's fur, checking for other injuries. Apart from the wounded leg, the cat seemed relatively unharmed. But the cat's trembling told Jonah there was more pain than met the eye. Fear and distress could wound just as deeply. A wave of apprehension swept over him. He glanced around the clearing, half expecting to see a figure lurking among the trees, some nefarious soul who had set that rope. But all he saw were silent pines and a dancing shaft of golden sunlight. Jonah exhaled shakily. He had planned on a peaceful hike filled with scenic vistas and birdwatching. Instead, fate had handed him a wounded cat and an uneasy feeling that something sinister was at play. Carefully, he lifted the cat into his arms, jacket and all, feeling the creature's trembling body pressed against his chest. He whispered, "I've got you now. We'll get you patched up, okay?" With that, Jonah collected his backpack, held the cat close and set off through the forest. He did not notice how tightly his own heart was pounding, nor did he realize that this was only the beginning of a perilous journey, one that would lead him deeper into the wild than he had ever intended to go, and test the limits of his courage in ways he never thought possible. Jonah soon discovered that carrying an anxious cat through dense underbrush was no small task. The cat, alarmed by every snapped twig and shifting shadow, would occasionally let out a hiss or squirm. Jonah tried to soothe it, whispering nonsense about how he once had a childhood kitten named Nibbles, and how they would share peanut butter sandwiches. Though admittedly, the cat had not been particularly fond of peanut butter. About 30 minutes after freeing the cat, Jonah stumbled upon a narrow game trail that meandered toward a nearby stream. He hoped to find a calm spot where he could clean the cat's wound. The forest canopy towered overhead, blocking much of the sun's heat. Still, Jonah felt beads of sweat forming along his brow, partly from exertion, partly from nerves. As he walked, he noticed small signs that unsettled him. Broken branches at strange angles, footprints that looked too large to be from a casual hiker, and scraps of plastic netting lying in the brush. Traps, snares, and litter. Someone was definitely up to no good. Jonah felt a wave of anger. There was something uniquely infuriating about people who would harm defenseless animals or disregard the sanctity of a protected wild area. At last he reached the stream. It was a narrow, lively flow of water, shaded by overhanging cedar trees. Moss-clad rocks lined the banks, and the air carried a cool, refreshing humidity that kissed Jonah's cheeks. He found a relatively flat boulder near the edge and gingerly placed the cat down. The cat's eyes darted, taking in its surroundings. Jonah knelt beside it, rummaging through his backpack again for his first aid kit. He had never tried tending a cat's injury before, but at least he knew how to disinfect a wound and wrap a bandage. "Let's see what we can do," Jonah said softly, though his hands shook with adrenaline. He doused a clean cloth with a bit of water from his canteen mixed with antiseptic. The cat let out a pitiful meow, which nearly broke Jonah's heart. "I know, buddy. I know," he murmured, doing his best to dab away the dried blood around the paw. The cat winced and let out a sharp hiss but did not claw him. Jonah took that as a small victory. The water in the stream burbled cheerfully, providing an odd contrast to Jonah's intense worry. He carefully applied some antibiotic ointment and then wrapped the cat's paw with the old bandana. The makeshift bandage looked a bit comical, bright red cotton with tiny white polka dots, now enveloping the cat's small paw, but Jonah hoped it would hold until he found a better solution. Once the cat was bandaged, Jonah allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He dipped his hands into the cool water, splashing his face. The cat stared at him, as if amazed by this human's odd rituals. Jonah offered a tentative grin. "I bet you think I'm a weirdo, huh?" he said, water dripping from his chin. "Trust me, so do most people." A nervous laugh escaped him. This little cat, frightened, hurt, had no idea just how close it had come to a far worse fate. Jonah's mind buzzed with questions. How did the cat end up ensnared? Are there more traps around? Should I carry this cat all the way back to civilization? His campsite was still a long hike away, and the nearest ranger station was even farther. While Jonah tried to decide his next step, a noise brought him sharply to attention. A snap of a branch followed by hushed voices. He froze, shoulders tense. The cat's ears perked up in alarm. A surge of anxiety coursed through him, and he carefully set the cat on his lap, keeping a hand on its back to soothe it. Straining his ears, Jonah realized that the voices sounded rough and agitated. Cautiously, he rose from the rock, the cat tucked securely in the crook of his arm. He edged closer to the dense cluster of ferns that ringed the stream, peering through them. About 20 yards away, behind a screen of leaves, he glimpsed two figures rummaging through the undergrowth. They appeared to be middle-aged men in dark, tattered clothing, each carrying what looked like a long metal tool. Jonah couldn't quite make out if they were rifles or something else. They moved with the restless energy of people searching for something, occasionally muttering curses that drifted faintly on the breeze. Jonah's heart pounded like a frantic drum. Poachers? That was his immediate thought. It would explain the snare. Maybe they were laying illegal traps for small predators, fur-bearers, or anything that might fetch money on the black market. And if they were willing to set cruel traps for animals, Jonah shuddered to imagine how they might treat a random hiker who stumbled onto their operation. A wave of terror overcame him, and he ducked back behind the ferns, adrenaline surging through his veins. The cat let out a low growl, sensing his fear. "Shoo!" Jonah whispered, trying to calm them both. He needed to get away. The cat needed medical attention, and Jonah needed to avoid whatever confrontation loomed if those men spotted him. He did not have a cell phone signal this deep in the wilderness, so calling for backup was out of the question. His best plan for now was to slip away quietly. Jonah's every nerve felt alive, each footstep measured and slow. Thankfully, the sound of the men's rummaging covered the crunch of his boots on the forest floor. Step by step, he backed away from the stream, the cat clinging to his jacket. It took all of Jonah's concentration not to trip over a root or rustle a bush too loudly. After a tense few minutes, he was far enough that he no longer heard their voices. He exhaled, but his relief was short-lived. He realized that any route back to the main trail might be compromised. If these poachers were indeed patrolling the area, Jonah's safest move might be to find a path deeper into the forest until he could loop around later. He studied his tattered map, which looked suspiciously like it had been rained on one too many times. The lines and contour intervals threatened to smear into a vague blot if he wasn't careful. With trembling fingers, Jonah plotted a rough course. He would veer north, skirt around the base of the mountain, and attempt to emerge near a known ranger's path. It would likely take him the rest of the day and a good chunk of the evening. The cat meowed softly as if to say, "What have you gotten us into?" Jonah managed a small, ironic smile. "Trust me, my friend, I'd rather be anywhere else too. Maybe a nice cat-friendly cafe. But we'll get through this." He gently patted the cat's head, earning a suspicious glare from the feline, followed by a tiny purr that made Jonah's chest tighten with warmth. "We're in this together now." He resolved to keep moving. With each step, Jonah felt a mounting sense of responsibility, not only for his own safety but for this little life that had been thrown into peril. The cat had no one else out here. No warm home waiting, no caretaker searching. Jonah was all it had, and the weight of that fact pressed heavily on him, pushing him forward. He sensed that this journey would test him more than any past rescue mission, requiring both caution and courage. Even as he set out, Jonah could not shake the ominous feeling that those poachers, and any number of unpredictable forces in the wild, would soon be converging. A swirl of uncertainty filled his mind. He glanced down at the cat, who looked up with half-lidded eyes that seemed to ask, "Are you sure we should trust each other?" Jonah did not have an easy answer. But something told him that forging this bond was not just about survival. It was about rediscovering his own capacity for compassion and bravery. Thus, with wary eyes on the shadows beneath the evergreens, Jonah ventured onward, unaware of just how far from the path he would stray or how fierce the coming trials would be. All he knew was that he could not abandon the cat now, not after seeing firsthand the cruelty that lurked in these woods. Whether he liked it or not, they were a team. An unlikely duo thrown together by circumstance and bound by a fragile thread of hope. As midday approached, the sky overhead began to darken. Thick slate-gray clouds gathered with ominous speed, and a hush fell over the forest. Jonah looked up, a frown tugging at his lips. The forecast had not mentioned a storm, but weather in the mountains was notoriously unpredictable. He picked up his pace, hoping to find some kind of shelter, perhaps a rocky overhang or a small cave, before the heavens opened. The cat, swaddled in Jonah's jacket, occasionally peeked its head out, whiskers twitching nervously. After about an hour of careful progress, thunder rumbled in the distance. Jonah paused, scanning the terrain for any place to hunker down. The land sloped upward here, dotted with towering fir trees and boulders worn smooth by countless seasons. Sure enough, he spotted a rocky formation near a cluster of pines, a low overhang that might offer limited protection. A gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending leaves into a frantic dance. Jonah rushed forward, ducking beneath the rocky shelter just as the first cold raindrops splattered on the ground. He set the cat down gently, its wide green eyes reflecting both curiosity and fear. The cat limped slightly, favoring the bandaged paw. Lightning flashed, followed by a reverberating crack of thunder that made Jonah's heart leap. The rain intensified, sheets of water crashing onto the leaves, turning the forest floor into a muddy tapestry. The cat let out a soft, mournful yowl and pressed against Jonah's leg, seeking warmth and reassurance. Jonah could not help but offer a gentle stroke along the cat's back, murmuring that everything would be all right, though he hardly believed it himself. Time seemed to stretch. Huddled under that rocky ledge, Jonah felt the weight of his predicament. The day was slipping away, and he was nowhere near a main trail. It might take him 2 days, 2 spelled out, of solid hiking to reach a ranger station if he avoided detection. Plus, the cat's injury needed proper care soon. He scrolled through possible plans in his mind like flipping pages in a half-burned book. None of them seemed particularly wonderful, but the best one was to wait out the storm, then continue north, ever north, until he found a safe route back. He contemplated building a small fire, but the rain was too heavy, and any attempt risked drawing unwanted attention from the poachers if they were still roaming. Another crash of thunder rippled overhead, echoing through the valley. Jonah closed his eyes, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. Minutes later, he heard an abrupt snap of a twig, far too close to be caused by the storm. Jonah's eyes flew open. Instinctively, he placed a hand on the cat, urging it to stay quiet. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he strained to listen over the pounding rain. Then came a voice, faint but distinct. "I swear I saw footprints this way," a man growled. Jonah's stomach twisted into knots. It was the same harsh tone he had heard before at the stream. A second voice responded, "We should head back. Boss said to stick to the perimeter lines, and we're too close to the ridge. Storm's messing up the tracks anyway." The first man cursed under his breath. "Whatever. We'll check that slope over there, then circle back. If someone's messing with our traps, we'll find him soon enough." Jonah froze, shoulders tight with dread. The cat seemed to sense his alarm and remained eerily still. Each moment stretched like taffy, long and unbearably tense. Through the curtain of rain, Jonah glimpsed 2 figures moving along the base of a nearby hill. They passed within maybe 30 yards, 30 spelled out, of Jonah's makeshift shelter, flashlights in hand, though the midday gloom hardly needed them. He could see the faint glint of something metallic slung over one man's shoulder. For a torturous minute or two, the men lingered, scanning the area. Rain soaked their coats, and they eventually trudged away, grumbling about the useless search. Jonah let out a silent exhale, heart thrashing so violently he wondered if the cat could feel it through the stone beneath them. He waited another 10 minutes, just to be sure, before finally allowing himself to breathe normally. The cat relaxed too, yawning with a squeak that was almost comical. In that moment of relative safety, Jonah realized how profoundly their circumstances had changed. They were no longer just lost hikers trying to escape the weather. They were fugitives in their own right, evading men who would likely hurt them if discovered. This knowledge pressed on Jonah's chest like a heavy stone. When the storm began to ease into a softer drizzle, Jonah debated his next move. If he stayed under the ledge until nightfall, he could travel under the cover of darkness. Less chance of being seen. But night hiking in unfamiliar, mountainous terrain with an injured cat was asking for trouble. On the other hand, if he moved too soon, the poachers might still be patrolling. Neither option was ideal. He glanced at the cat, which was now curled in his jacket, grooming its injured paw with delicate licks. Jonah's heart melted at the sight. The cat had already endured so much, and yet it carried on with a regal sense of composure as though remarking, "This is not my favorite day, but I'm making do." Jonah's lips curved into a small smile, a bit of light humor creeping into his otherwise dire situation. In the end, he chose a middle path. He would wait until the heaviest part of the storm passed, give the poachers some time to move off, and then press forward while there was still enough daylight to see. He figured if luck was on his side, a big if, he might find a safer route through a ravine or a low pass that would hide their approach. The rain tapered to a drizzle around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, spelled out. Jonah carefully packed up his belongings. He refastened the cat's bandage, which had become damp during the storm. Then, with the cat swaddled in his arms, he stepped out from under the rocky shelf, feeling the cold sting of leftover raindrops. A chilly wind gusted through the trees, carrying the scent of wet pine and damp soil. As he made his way north, the path became treacherous. Mud slicked the ground, and the slope's rocky surface forced him to pick his steps with care. Several times he slipped and nearly fell, clutching the cat protectively. Each time the cat let out a startled mew, and Jonah murmured reassurances. He could feel every muscle in his body tense, bracing for the next hazard. Despite the tension, a piece of Jonah's mind wandered to the absurdity of it all. He was trekking through the wilderness, cat in tow, running from poachers in a scenario that felt ripped straight out of a dramatic adventure film. A small laugh escaped him, startling the cat, who meowed as if to say, "Did you seriously just giggle right now?" Jonah mumbled an apology to the cat and carried on. Evening light began to fade sooner than expected, thanks to the lingering storm clouds. By roughly 6 o'clock, spelled out, the forest was draped in the dusky gloom of approaching night. Jonah's stomach growled. He realized he had not eaten properly since early morning. He paused, rummaging through his pack to find a protein bar. He nibbled on it, sharing a tiny piece with the cat, which sniffed it disdainfully before swallowing with minimal enthusiasm. At least it was something. Further up the slope, Jonah spotted a cluster of dense pines that might offer partial shelter from the wind. He trudged there, carefully pushing aside branches. The ground beneath the trees was drier, protected from the worst of the rain. He set the cat down, and it immediately tested the earth with a few cautious steps, tail swishing. Jonah decided to make camp here for the night. Using the minimal supplies he had, he fashioned a crude lean-to with a lightweight tarp and some rope. It was far from luxurious, but hopefully it would keep them both from getting soaked again if the rain returned. He spread out a sleeping pad and wrapped himself in a flimsy emergency blanket, positioning the cat between his body and the tarp for warmth. The cat purred softly, an incredible sound in the midst of their precarious surroundings. As darkness settled fully over the forest, Jonah lay awake, every rustle making his nerves jangle. The cat occasionally stirred, pressing closer to him. He found solace in the soft vibration of its purring, a rhythm that lulled him toward an uneasy sleep. Before he drifted off, Jonah whispered, "We'll figure this out, buddy. Just hang in there." Yet in the back of his mind, a storm of worry still raged. The men with the traps were out there, the mountain nights were cold and hazardous, and the cat's legs still needed more care. Jonah felt both fear and a flicker of resolute courage, a fragile flame that refused to be snuffed out. In that moment, he resolved to do whatever it took to safeguard this small creature who had, in a matter of hours, become so much more than just a stranger in the woods. Jonah woke to a forest shrouded in pale morning light. The cat was curled against his side, its breaths warm and steady. Overnight, the temperature had dropped noticeably, but the makeshift shelter had at least kept them partly sheltered from the wind. His limbs felt stiff and sore as he carefully sat up, rubbing his neck. Outside, the world was dripping with raindrops that clung to every leaf and pine needle. A gentle mist hung in the air, giving the landscape an almost ethereal glow. Jonah yawned, glancing around to see if there were any signs of intrusion, but the forest seemed quiet. Even the birds had not yet begun their morning chorus, as if they too were waiting for the sun to burn away the damp chill. His stomach growled loudly, an awkward reminder that he had only half a protein bar since the previous afternoon. He rummaged for another bar and a packet of freeze-dried fruit, splitting some of it with the cat. This time the cat seemed a bit hungrier and licked the dried bits of strawberry with a comical grimace, as though thinking, "This is not exactly gourmet, but it'll do." Jonah found himself smiling, a ray of humor piercing through the tension. He checked the cat's bandaged paw. The fabric was slightly wet, so he carefully peeled it off. The wound looked a bit cleaner but still raw. Jonah used more antiseptic from his dwindling supply. "You're one tough kitty," he whispered, wrapping a fresh strip of cloth around the paw. The cat endured it with only a subdued hiss. By 7 o'clock, spelled out, Jonah packed up the lean-to and resumed his trek. The ground squished beneath his boots, and a low fog clung to the slopes, making navigation tricky. He consulted his soggy map again, trying to decipher a safe route that would take him away from the poacher's territory. He had to find a path that looped around to the main ranger trail without doubling back too close to the stream where he had encountered those men. As the hours dragged on, the slope became steeper. Jonah alternated between carrying the cat, when the brush was too thick or the terrain too rough, and letting it walk gingerly beside him on flatter stretches. Occasionally, the cat would meow in protest, and Jonah would deliver a sarcastic "Apologies, Your Royal Highness," under his breath. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a spark of fondness for his feline companion's feisty spirit. Around midday, the sun broke through the clouds, warming Jonah's chilled bones. He paused on a narrow ridge to catch his breath. From this vantage, he could see rolling green expanses of forest below, dotted with patches of bare rock. The sky overhead was a brilliant blue, the storm's fury washed away. Yet, as Jonah gazed at the breathtaking vista, a ripple of unease coiled in his stomach. Far off, near the lower valley, he spotted a faint column of smoke rising. Maybe it was a campfire, or perhaps the poachers had set up a more permanent camp. Either way, it was a reminder that danger lingered. "Let's keep moving," he muttered to the cat, who responded with a flick of its tail. Jonah ventured downward along the ridge, slipping on loose gravel and occasionally disturbing a startled bird that took flight with a squawk. His arms ached from carrying the pack, and sometimes the cat, but adrenaline kept him going. Just after passing a jagged outcrop of rock, Jonah's foot snagged on a tangle of vines. Before he could react, he lost his balance, tumbling forward. He managed to twist midfall so that he would not land on the cat, but his shoulder collided hard with the ground. A jolt of pain shot through him, and the cat leaped free, hissing in alarm. For several heartbeats, Jonah lay there, groaning. His shoulder throbbed, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The cat stood a few feet away, back-arched, eyes wide. Jonah forced a reassuring laugh that sounded more like a cough. "I'm okay, just testing gravity," he mumbled. Slowly, he pushed himself into a sitting position, rotating his arm to check for injuries. It was sore, but nothing seemed broken. "Could have been worse," he told the cat, who stared at him as though evaluating the potential comedic value of the situation. Jonah gingerly got to his feet, wiping dirt and pine needles from his clothes. "We can't afford too many of those slip-ups," he added. The cat meowed, perhaps in agreement. As they pressed on, the forest canopy thickened, the late afternoon sun casting dappled shadows on the ground. A distant rumble of something like an engine drifted through the trees. Jonah froze, heart leaping. It could be a ranger's ATV, but more likely it was the poacher's. The cat also tensed, ears twitching. Jonah placed a hand on the cat's back, guiding it behind a broad spruce trunk. They waited there, bodies pressed to the bark. The engine noise came closer, then faded, then returned. Jonah squinted, trying to catch a glimpse. Through a gap in the foliage, he saw a battered old ATV crawling along a faint trail below. Two men sat on it, possibly the same pair as before, scanning the forest with hawk-like intensity. Jonah's heart hammered. He remembered the rope trap, the men's harsh voices. A wave of dread washed over him. He could not afford to be spotted now, especially not with the cat limping by his side. He waited until they were out of earshot, then carefully resumed his trek. This was no longer just a nature walk, it was a game of cat and mouse, though ironically the cat was on his team. He had to outmaneuver or evade these poachers at every turn, mindful that his every footstep could betray his location. A couple of hours later, Jonah noticed the cat was lagging, its wounded paw dragging more than before. Pity welled in his chest. The cat needed rest and probably a proper vet's attention. Jonah brushed a gentle hand across its fur. "Hang in there," he said, voice cracking with sympathy. He lifted the cat into his arms once more, feeling the trembling of its exhausted body. "I'm sorry. This is rough on both of us." They pressed on until dusk, the sky streaked with hues of pink and lavender. Jonah's arms burned from the effort of carrying the cat. His stomach churned with hunger, and he felt the edges of fatigue creeping in. Yet he pushed forward, driven by a potent mix of worry for the cat, anger at the poachers, and a stubborn resolve to make it out of this wilderness safely. When he finally reached a small clearing ringed by tall pines, Jonah decided to make camp again. The clearing was inconspicuous, with a soft bed of needles underfoot that might provide some comfort. He set the cat down and rummaged for something that could serve as dinner. His supplies were dangerously low: a single energy bar, some trail mix, and a packet of instant oatmeal. He sighed, dividing the meager rations between himself and the cat. The cat ate without protest this time, as if too weary to be picky. Night fell quickly, stars blinking into view above the towering silhouettes of the pines. Jonah tried to stave off the cold by bundling himself and the cat under the emergency blanket. The cat's body felt warm but frail, its purring reduced to a faint vibration. Jonah felt a knot in his throat. He wondered if the cat would hold up if this ordeal dragged on much longer. If only I could contact a ranger, he thought. If only there was a phone signal. But regrets were useless. Right now, all that mattered was surviving the night and edging closer to safety with the first rays of dawn. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, Jonah's last conscious thought was a silent prayer for the resilience of both himself and the small creature he cradled in his arms. The morning arrived with a surreal stillness. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to have taken a pause. Jonah awoke with a sense of foreboding, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The cat stirred in his arms, letting out a small mewl of discomfort. Jonah realized his own back was stiff from yet another night on the cold ground. He forced himself to eat the remainder of his trail mix, aware that it might be his last real meal for a while. The cat licked a few crumbs from his palm, then glanced at him with wide, pleading eyes. "I'm sorry," Jonah said softly. "Once we get to the rangers, we'll have a feast, okay?" The cat blinked in what he hoped was agreement. They continued north, weaving through dense patches of undergrowth. The forest floor was damp with dew, glistening in the early sunlight. Jonah soon discovered that traveling in the underbrush was noisy and slow, but it kept them hidden from any prying eyes. He angled himself west whenever he spotted an open area, just in case the poachers were monitoring the obvious paths. Shortly before midday, Jonah stepped onto a faint trail that seemed to run parallel to a wide creek. He was about to turn away, thinking it might be risky, when he heard a loud crash. His heart practically leaped into his throat. He crouched, motioning the cat to stay low. Slowly, he peeked through a thicket of ferns. Ahead, maybe 30 feet away, spelled out, stood a small group of men. He recognized two from before: weathered faces, coarse attire. But now there were 3 more, all carrying rifles. Jonah felt a wave of horror engulf him. 5 spelled out, heavily armed individuals, clearing what looked like an illicit campsite. Tents, camouflage tarps, crates. One man barked orders, instructing the others to dismantle something near the creek bank. Jonah guessed it might be a stash of traps or an illegal haul of animal parts. The sight turned his stomach. Among the crates, Jonah spotted cages, large wire cages. Even from his vantage, he could see movement within them, frightened eyes of various creatures. This was worse than he had imagined. They were capturing animals wholesale. An unsteady rage flared in Jonah's chest, and he had to clench his fists to keep from doing something reckless. He glanced at the cat, who peered at the scene, ears flat with unease. Then, in a chilling moment, one of the men looked in Jonah's direction. Jonah ducked, heart pounding so hard he worried the men could hear it. He held his breath, the cat pressed close to his leg. For an agonizing stretch of seconds, he heard the men's muffled voices. Then footsteps approached. Jonah squeezed his eyes shut, expecting discovery at any moment. "Hey Mick, give me a hand," one man shouted. The footsteps halted, then retreated. Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears, but the immediate crisis passed. He waited, crouched behind the ferns, for what felt like hours but was likely only a few minutes. When he dared to look again, the men were busy loading crates onto the ATV. Jonah felt an urgent need to do something, call for help, Free the captive animals, expose these criminals. But he was alone, outnumbered, and had no weapon besides a pocket knife. The cat's life was already on the line, and so was Jonah's. There's nothing I can do right now, he told himself, teeth clenched. I'll alert the authorities once we're safe. Still, leaving those animals behind weighed heavily on him. A swirl of helplessness and anger settled in the pit of his stomach. He slithered backward on his elbows, the cat following in a tense crouch, until they were far enough to make a quiet retreat. With each step away from that campsite, Jonah's resolve hardened. He had to get out of these woods, contact the rangers, and ensure those poachers were stopped. They had turned the wilderness into a place of fear, setting snares and caging wildlife. Jonah refused to let them continue if he had any power to prevent it. His mind raced with potential strategies. Could he sabotage their vehicles? Risky. Could he slip in at night to free the animals? Far too dangerous, especially with the cat reliant on him. The best plan remained the same: reach the safety of civilization, or at least the official trail where he could find a ranger. As the afternoon wore on, the forest terrain grew more rugged. Jonah found himself climbing over boulders, pushing through thick clusters of shrubs, and wincing at each slip. The cat soldiered on, though its wounded leg clearly pained it. By late afternoon, Jonah suspected he was nearing the outskirts of the mountain range, judging by the slope's gradual descent and the glimpses of a broad valley in the distance. This gave him a glimmer of hope. However, just when he thought they might be safely evading the poachers, a sudden commotion erupted behind him. The sound of an ATV's engine revved in the distance. Jonah's stomach clenched. Had they spotted him? He broke into a stumbling run, cat cradled in his arms. The undergrowth whipped at his legs, leaves slapping his face. His lungs burned, but he pushed on, hearing the engine roar closer. In a blind scramble, Jonah saw a break in the trees, an area of large boulders that might conceal him. He dashed for it, nearly dropping the cat in his hurry. The cat meowed in protest, claws lightly digging into his arm. Jonah slid behind a boulder, panting, heart hammering. The ATV's engine whined, passing frighteningly close. Jonah risked a peek and glimpsed two of the poachers scanning the area, rifles resting across their laps. He held his breath, every nerve on high alert. The cat was silent, its eyes focused on the menace beyond the rocks. For a tense minute, the ATV idled, men muttering curses about some meddling hiker messing with their traps. Jonah's chest felt as though it might explode from the pressure of holding in his breathing. He squeezed the cat gently as if to say, "Stay calm, stay with me." Eventually, one man spat on the ground. "He can't have gone far," he growled. "We'll keep searching." The other man nodded, and the ATV roared off, continuing its hunt. Jonah waited until the engine noise faded into distant hum before he exhaled shakily. He was drenched in sweat, his legs trembling. The cat seemed equally rattled, releasing a tiny hiss as if cursing the day it ever left a cozy fireplace. Jonah understood the sentiment all too well. Realizing he could not linger, Jonah pressed on, guided by the dwindling daylight. The cat was limp in his arms, exhaustion weighing it down. Jonah's own energy felt drained, but desperation lent him a renewed burst of willpower. They had to find a better hiding spot for the night, somewhere the ATV could not easily reach. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, Jonah was stumbling through thick undergrowth again, scanning for any sign of a cave, a hollow in the ground, anything. At last, he spotted a rocky escarpment with a crevice at its base. It was narrow, but it might just be enough to hide in. With a determined grunt, Jonah squeezed through the gap, cat held protectively against his chest. Inside, the space opened into a shallow recess that smelled of damp earth and old leaves. He collapsed against the stone wall, gasping for breath. The cat meowed, a plaintive, weary sound. "I know, buddy," Jonah croaked, voice nearly gone from stress and dryness. "One more night. We just have to make it. Then tomorrow we keep going until we find the ranger's path." As if in agreement, the cat curled into the crook of his arm, eyes half closed. Outside, the night forest breathed softly, a gentle wind murmuring through the pine needles. Jonah closed his eyes and let himself drift, though the threat of the poachers lingered in every creak of a branch. Before sleep claimed him, he felt a subtle wave of resolve. Tomorrow he would not just run. He would find a way to end this chase and save the cat once and for all. The alternative was unthinkable. Jonah awoke to the faint glow of dawn peeking through the rocky crevice. His body felt battered, each muscle aching from the relentless scramble. The cat still dozed on his chest, its purring a soft rumble against his pounding heart. Despite the hardships, a sense of calm settled over Jonah. Perhaps the calm before the storm. Carefully, he extricated himself from the cat's cozy position and peered outside. The forest was bathed in a pale, ghostly light. No sign of the poachers, at least not immediately. Jonah's hunger had reached a gnawing point, and he had nothing left to eat. He looked down at the cat, who blinked sleepily, as if demanding breakfast with regal authority. "I'm afraid we're both out of luck," Jonah whispered, a rueful smile forming. "Let's just hope we find that ranger station soon." Gathering his courage, Jonah slipped out of the crevice, scanning the area. All was quiet. The dawn chorus had begun in earnest, with birds calling from the treetops, unaware of the peril that stalked the forest floor. Jonah took a few tentative steps. His legs felt wobbly, but he pushed past the fatigue. "We have to move." He hoisted the cat gently, eliciting a tired meow. "Sorry, buddy," Jonah said. "We'll rest properly once we're safe." The cat nuzzled his arm, perhaps a small gesture of trust. That tiny sign of affection touched Jonah deeply, fueling his resolve. Navigating through the thinning pines, Jonah noticed subtle changes in the terrain that signaled a descent toward lower elevations. This was good news. Closer to valley floors meant closer to roads or official trails. The morning sun stretched golden rays through the branches, warming Jonah's chilled bones. For the first time in days, a flicker of optimism blossomed in his chest. We might actually make it. Then, an echo of distant voices shattered his hope. Jonah's pulse quickened. He scanned the horizon and spotted movement through the trees. Two silhouettes emerged on a parallel slope, rifles slung across their backs. Jonah's stomach sank. "They're still searching." He ducked behind a fallen log, pressing the cat to his chest. The men's voices drifted closer. Jonah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain silent. One man spat. "We should have found that hiker by now. Boss ain't happy." The other man cursed under his breath, adding, "If he's got that cat, it's not worth anything anyway. We got bigger catches to worry about." Jonah's fists tightened. The cat was worth everything to him at this point. He could not bear the thought of leaving it to these brutes. The men trudged on, scanning the foliage. Jonah's mind raced, searching for a route of escape. He spotted a steep ravine to his left, its edges lined with brush. If he could slip down there, maybe the thick undergrowth would hide him. But the men were too close. They could spot him if he made any sudden moves. A wave of indecision froze Jonah. Then a loud crack resonated, as though someone stepped on a dry branch. Jonah's heart lurched. The men whirled around, rifles at the ready. One of them fired a shot into the air, the sharp retort echoing through the trees. The cat let out a terrified yowl, and Jonah nearly jumped out of his skin. He clamped a hand over the cat's mouth, whispering, Shoo, it's okay," though his own heart was hammering so loud it drowned out all rational thought. The men advanced, cutting the distance in half. Jonah's mind screamed, "Run!" But if he ran, they would see him for sure. Another shot rang out, splintering a branch overhead. Fragments of wood rained down, and Jonah realized with cold certainty that these men were not simply trying to scare him. They were aiming to kill. A wave of terror overcame him so fierce that his body trembled. At that moment, something in Jonah snapped. The fear fused with anger, forging an unexpected courage. He refused to let the cat die here, not after everything they had endured. Slowly, quietly, he eased out from behind the log, scanning for a route. The men were angled slightly to his right, leaving a narrow gap to the left that led toward the ravine. Jonah took a silent breath, counted to 3 spelled out in his head, and darted. Bullets whizzed by, snapping through branches. Jonah sprinted, half-blind with panic, the cat pressed tight to his chest. The slope leading down to the ravine was slick with morning dew, and Jonah nearly lost his footing. He tumbled forward, rolling onto his side to protect the cat. The cat yowled, claws digging into Jonah's jacket. A wave of dread hammered Jonah's heart as he slid and scraped against rock and wet leaves. Pain lanced through his shoulder again. Behind him, the men shouted, their footfalls crunching on gravel. Jonah struggled to his feet. He was in the ravine now, the edges lined with thick brush that might conceal him momentarily. Gasping for breath, he pelted forward, ignoring the burning in his legs. Every muscle pleaded for rest, but the survival instinct roared too loudly. Then, in a cruel twist, Jonah found his path blocked by a fallen tree trunk bridging the ravine. Jagged branches jutted out like an impassable barrier. Above, the men were closing in. Jonah's mind spun. He could attempt to scramble over the trunk, but he risked getting stuck or slowed down. No choice. He forced the cat through a gap in the branches first, then wedged himself behind it. The splintered wood snagged his clothing, scraping his skin. Each second felt like an eternity. Behind him, he heard the men's curses and the clatter of rocks as they descended into the ravine. Jonah's heart hammered with the frantic desire to survive. With a final burst of effort, he and the cat slipped through the barrier. Emerging on the far side of the ravine, Jonah half fell onto the muddy bank, adrenaline surging. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his shoulder. The men's shouting grew louder. They were close, so close. Jonah grabbed a fist-sized rock, whirled around, and hurled it blindly in the direction of the voices. It crashed into the wooden trunk with a loud thud, momentarily startling them. Using that second of confusion, Jonah took off through the undergrowth, cat clutched to his chest. His mind whirled, fear and desperation spurring him onward. He did not look back. He could not. All he could do was pray that the men would be slowed by the natural obstacles that had nearly trapped him. Branches slapped his cheeks, ferns tugged at his ankles. At one point he splashed through a shallow creek, soaking his boots. The cat trembled in his arms, panting from exertion or terror, likely both. Jonah's breath rasped in his throat, his lungs burning as if on fire. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of frantic running, Jonah collapsed behind a large boulder near a mossy hillside. He could no longer hear pursuit. He lay there, chest heaving, the cat pressed against his ribcage. Time seemed suspended in the hush of the forest. Gradually, his breathing slowed, and the cat let out a weak meow as if to say, "That was way too close." Jonah could not disagree. He was shaking, adrenaline coursing through him in nauseating waves. The brush with death had etched itself into his bones. In those horrifying moments, one truth rang clear. If he did not find help soon, he and the cat might not get another chance. Wiping sweat from his brow, Jonah checked the cat. Its bandage was torn and the paw bled anew. With trembling hands, he applied the last of his disinfectant and used a strip of cloth from his own shirt to wrap the wound. The cat barely struggled, it seemed too exhausted. Jonah leaned his head back against the boulder, forcing his racing thoughts to calm. "We're close to the outer edges of the wilderness," he reminded himself, recalling the topography. "If I keep heading west, I should stumble onto the ranger station or at least a service road." He had to believe that. There was no other option. Using the boulder as a shield, Jonah peered around it, scanning the forest. All was still. No rustle of footfalls or growl of engines. Perhaps the poachers lost track of him in the maze of ravines and thick brush. Gathering his meager courage, Jonah started west again, moving as swiftly and quietly as he could. The cat, cradled in his arms, dozed on and off, too weak to walk on its own. Hours passed in a weary haze. The sun climbed high overhead, then began its slow descent. Each step felt like a monumental effort. Jonah's stomach was beyond empty, and his throat begged for water. Thankfully, he refilled his canteen at a small stream. The cat lapped at it greedily, its whiskers glistening with droplets. Jonah felt a flicker of relief that at least they were somewhat hydrated. By late afternoon, Jonah spotted a sign, literally. A weathered wooden marker jutted from the base of a tree, partially hidden by tall grass. Faded letters read, "Ranger Patrol Route, 1 mile west." Jonah's heart soared. Though spelled out, that was one spelled out mile to what might be rescue. He half jogged toward the indicated direction, ignoring the burning protest of his muscles. As he neared a gentle bend in the trail, he caught sight of a small wooden structure up ahead. It was more of a hut than a full-blown station, but it bore the official emblem of the Park Service. Jonah nearly collapsed from relief. Trembling with joy and exhaustion, he approached the door. It was locked. A sign read, "Ranger on rounds, check back soon." Jonah let out a hysterical laugh. Of course. Still, there had to be some sort of radio or phone inside. Time was critical. If the poachers found him here, cornered with nowhere to run, that would be the end. He circled the cabin and found a small window left ajar. Mind racing, he decided to climb through. Normally, the idea of breaking into a ranger station would feel very wrong, but this was a matter of life and death. Setting the cat gently on the ground, Jonah struggled to hoist himself up. His arms felt like lead, his shoulders still aching from the falls. Eventually, he managed to wriggle through, landing awkwardly on the cabin's dusty floor. He reached back out the window and lifted the cat, who let out an indignant meow. Inside, he saw a simple desk, a chair, and a wall-mounted radio. Jonah's chest tightened with relief at the sight of the radio. He rushed over, flicking it on. Static crackled, and after fiddling with the dial, he managed to catch a faint voice on the frequency. "Hello." Jonah croaked into the microphone. "Is anyone there? I need help. There are poachers in the area and I'm injured. There's also an injured cat. Please respond." For a few agonizing seconds, only static greeted him. Then a scratchy voice answered. "This is Ranger Acker." "Who is this?" Jonah almost sobbed with gratitude. He explained his situation as succinctly as possible. The ranger's tone shifted to alarm. "Stay put. I'll be there as soon as I can. I'm about 2 miles north," 2 spelled out. "Lock the doors, keep your head down." Jonah thanked the ranger, tears stinging his eyes. He set the radio aside and glanced at the cat, who was curled on the floor, eyes half closed. Jonah gently stroked its fur. "We're going to be okay," he whispered. "We're really going to be okay." But fate had one more trial in store. A distant rumble of an engine broke the tranquility. Jonah's blood ran cold. He looked out the small cabin window and saw an ATV cresting a rise, heading straight for the ranger station. "They found us." The cat sensed his panic and meowed, staggering to its feet. Jonah's hand shook as he locked the door and secured the window latch. The cabin was small and hardly fortified. If these men wanted to force their way in, it would not be difficult. Jonah looked around for anything he could use as a weapon. He found a heavy flashlight on the desk and an old flare gun in a supply cabinet. His heart pounded. "I guess we fight," he muttered, a mix of terror and determination fueling him. Outside, the ATV roared to a stop. Jonah heard angry voices. He grabbed the cat, placing it carefully under the desk where it might be somewhat protected, then crouched behind the door, flashlight in one hand, flare gun in the other. His heart hammered like a wild drum. Bang! The door rattled with a powerful kick. "Open up, you little pest!" a man shouted. Bang! Another kick. The flimsy wood began to crack. Jonah's throat tightened with fear. He thought of all the steps that led him here, finding the cat, dodging traps, outrunning bullets. It all came down to this moment. He took a shaky breath, remembering why he was doing this. The cat's life, his own life, the wildlife these monsters were hurting. A surge of fierce resolve filled him. When the door splintered open, Jonah sprang forward, shining the flashlight in the assailant's eyes. The man cursed, raising a rifle. In a split second, Jonah fired the flare gun. A blaze of orange shot out, striking the man's shoulder. He let out a howl of pain, dropping the rifle. The flare sputtered on the ground, filling the cabin with acrid smoke. Another man charged in behind him. Jonah swung the flashlight like a bat, connecting with the intruder's jaw. The impact sent shocks through Jonah's arm, and he nearly lost his grip. The intruder stumbled, but not before lashing out with a punch that knocked Jonah backward. Jonah crashed into the desk, rattling the radio. The cat darted out from under the desk, hissing in terror. On the floor, Jonah's vision blurred. The man he had struck with the flashlight was recovering, face twisted in fury. The other man, clothes smoldering from the flare, was snarling curses. Jonah crawled for the rifle, but the second man kicked it away, brandishing a knife. A wave of horror swept over Jonah. This is it. He braced himself, trying to shield the cat. But then a thunderous shout echoed from outside. "Park Rangers! Drop your weapons!" The door frame exploded in a hail of splinters as several uniformed rangers stormed in, guns drawn. Everything happened in a blur. Rangers tackling the poachers, men shouting, the cat yowling amidst the chaos. Jonah slid into a dazed relief, tears mixing with sweat on his face. The presence of the rangers was like a salvation he hardly believed possible. In moments, the two intruders were disarmed, pinned to the ground, cursing and writhing. The cat, wide-eyed, found its way back to Jonah, pressing itself against his side, as though claiming him as protector. Jonah let out a breath he did not realize he was holding. They were finally safe. Ranger Acker, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a firm handshake, helped Jonah to his feet. "Are you all right?" she asked, scanning him for injuries. Jonah nodded, more or less, though he felt bruised from head to toe. She looked down at the cat, gently examining its wound. "We'll get you both medical attention," she assured him. "And we'll put an end to these men's poaching." Jonah nearly collapsed from relief. The cat let out a rattling purr. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jonah allowed himself to believe they had overcome the worst. 3 days, 3 spelled out, had passed since the confrontation at the ranger station. Jonah found himself seated on a sunlit porch outside a small veterinary clinic near the edge of the forest. His shoulder was bandaged, his bruises were healing, and he was devouring a sandwich like a starving wolf. He savored every bite, reveling in the simple joy of safe, real food. The cat, having undergone a minor procedure on its paw, was snoozing contentedly inside a cozy travel crate. The vet had assured Jonah that the cat would make a full recovery, though it would have a slight limp for a while. As for the poachers, the rangers had mobilized swiftly, arresting the entire group and rescuing the caged animals. A wave of gratitude swept through Jonah every time he thought about it. Justice, at least in some measure, had been served. Got room for one more on that bench? Ranger Acker asked, stepping onto the porch. She was out of uniform now, dressed in casual jeans and a light jacket. Jonah scooted over, offering a grateful smile. Thanks for everything, Jonah murmured. He glanced at the cat, who stirred and stretched within the crate. I honestly didn't think we'd make it out of there. Acker followed his gaze, nodding. You both went through a lot, she said, her voice warm with empathy. But you kept the cat safe, and you helped us bust a major poaching ring. You should be proud. Jonah let out a soft laugh, recalling the countless moments of doubt and fear along the journey. I think relieved is the better word than proud, he admitted. I'm just glad that cat won't have to endure any more of that cruelty. As if on cue, the cat let out a tiny meow from the crate. Jonah reached in to scratch its chin. The cat purred in response, pressing its head against his fingers. Emotion swelled in Jonah's chest, a sense of connection he had not felt in a long time. He could hardly believe how deeply he had come to care about this little feline. Once a terrified stranger in the woods, now a companion bonded by shared adversity. Any idea what you're going to do with it? Acker asked gently. We can try to find the owner, or a shelter if it's truly stray. Jonah looked at the cat, which gazed back with those bright green eyes. A wave of warmth spread through him, mingled with a dash of humor. I don't think I could part ways with this cat now, he said, scratching behind its ears. If it doesn't belong to anyone, I'll adopt it. I guess I owe it that much after all we've been through. Acker smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. Let me know if you need any help with the adoption process. Meanwhile, you should get some rest, both of you. Jonah nodded. He watched as Acker departed, then returned his attention to the cat. Well, he murmured, looks like we've got a future together. The cat blinked, probably unimpressed by Jonah's sentimentality. But Jonah's heart was full nonetheless. Within another hour, the vet cleared the cat for discharge, provided Jonah continued to care for the injured paw. Jonah signed a few forms, leaving a donation to help other animals in need. Carrying the crate, he stepped outside into the late afternoon sunshine. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Looking toward the forested mountains on the horizon, Jonah felt a profound sense of reverence for nature. The wilderness was beautiful, awe-inspiring, and fragile. The memory of those poachers' traps and cages still stung his mind. The cat's bandaged paw was a testament to how easily the delicate balance could be broken. Jonah knelt by a patch of soft grass, opening the crate. The cat padded out, limping slightly, but wearing an air of curiosity. It lifted its face to the sun, blinking contentedly. Then, in a gesture that took Jonah's breath away, the cat rubbed against his leg, purring as loudly as its small body would allow. Jonah smiled, tears pricking at his eyes. I get it, he said, voice trembling with emotion. Thanks for sticking around, and for trusting me after all of that. The cat responded by flicking its tail and meowing in a tone that sounded almost like you're welcome. Jonah laughed, a light, joyous sound that felt new and pure. The next day, August 7th, spelled out. Jonah found himself back near the forest's edge, this time standing on a paved overlook with a group of rangers, volunteers, and wildlife enthusiasts. They had gathered to celebrate the safe rescue of several animals from the poachers. Jonah held the cat, now sporting a much cleaner bandage, in his arms, accepting murmured thanks and congratulations, though he insisted he was no hero, just a guy who stumbled into the right place at the right time. As the small crowd began to disperse, Jonah stepped away to a quieter spot. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm gold light across the treetops. The cat shifted, letting out a soft meow, as if urging Jonah to take in the grandeur. He inhaled deeply, absorbing the scents of evergreen and fresh mountain air. Suddenly, in the forest below, he spotted a movement. An adult bobcat, stepping out from behind a stand of pines. Its sleek coat rippled as it moved with fluid grace. For a moment, the wild feline locked eyes with Jonah. There was no fear there, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then, with a flick of its tail, the bobcat melted back into the underbrush, free and unbound. Jonah felt his heart swell. He glanced down at the little cat in his arms, who regarded him with a curious tilt of its head. "Did you see that?" Jonah whispered, voice cracking with wonder. It felt like nature herself was offering a nod of approval, a silent thank you for caring, for intervening, for preserving life in these ancient woods. And in that moment, Jonah understood a profound truth. Every small act of compassion matters. Every creature saved is a victory. And every stand we take against cruelty reaffirms our bond with the natural world. The cat purred softly against Jonah's chest, and he closed his eyes, letting gratitude sweep over him like a warm tide. Thank you for journeying with Jonah and this determined little cat through the perilous depths of the wilderness. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest hours, compassion can guide us, courage can sustain us, and the bond between humans and nature is a precious gift worth protecting. If this tale of survival, friendship, and hope moved you, please share your thoughts. Leave a like, comment below, or share the story with someone who cares about animals and our wild spaces. Stories like these inspire us all to be kinder, to treasure the natural world, and to do our part in safeguarding vulnerable creatures, no matter how small. Nature is a tapestry of life, woven with threads of resilience, grace, and mystery. Every time we show kindness to an animal in need, we honor that tapestry. May this story remind us of the power each of us holds to protect and cherish the beauty around us. Thank you for reading, and may your next adventure be guided by compassion and respect for all living things.